Europe thought it was invincible until Africa hit back. In the late 19th century, the world was mesmerized by European power. Nations like Britain, France, and Italy expanded empires across continents, taking for granted that no kingdom could stand in their path. Africa, in the eyes of Europe, was a land to be carved and claimed, its rulers seen as obstacles to their inevitable conquest. Yet, amidst this tide of colonial ambition, one kingdom defied expectation. Ethiopia stood not as a backward outpost, but as a sovereign nation, ancient, proud, and determined to protect its independence. Its king, Menelik II, was a man whose intellect and foresight would challenge the arrogance of Europe and shake the world's perception of African power. Menelik was not merely a warrior, he was a visionary. He understood that survival required more than courage. It required strategy, diplomacy, and unity. Ethiopia had long been a land of diverse peoples, scattered kingdoms, and regional rivalries. To face a modern European army, Menelik needed to forge a unity that went beyond traditional loyalty. He began quietly, consolidating power and bringing together regional leaders under a single banner, ensuring that when the time came, Ethiopia would not fight in fragments, but as a single, formidable force. Meanwhile, Italy, eager to emulate the colonial exploits of Britain and France, believed Ethiopia would fall easily. Italian diplomats had negotiated treaties they misunderstood, claiming lands that Ethiopia did not intend to cede. Italian military leaders spoke with confidence, mocking the so-called primitive kingdom, certain that their modern weapons and European discipline would secure a swift victory. They saw Menelik as a curious figure. Educated, yes, but unlikely to pose a serious threat to trained European troops. Yet, Menelik had already anticipated their arrogance. He was a student of both European and African warfare, understanding that an overconfident opponent could be exploited. While Italy prepared its army, Menelik mobilized his people. Thousands of soldiers from across Ethiopia were called upon, each trained and equipped, each aware that the fate of their nation rested upon their courage and discipline. Local knowledge of mountains, rivers, and hidden passes became as crucial as rifles and cannons. Menelik coordinated supplies, communications, and reconnaissance, ensuring his forces could move swiftly, strike decisively, and retreat strategically if needed. As the Italian forces advanced toward northern Ethiopia, they encountered a land they scarcely understood. Harsh terrain slowed their progress. Unfamiliar mountains and valleys tested their discipline. Italian supply lines were stretched, their confidence unwavering but blind. At every step, Menelik's intelligence network observed them, noting weaknesses and anticipating maneuvers. He did not act rashly. Patience, precision, and preparation became his weapons as much as spears and rifles. The battle, when it came, was not merely a clash of armies, but a collision of wills. On the hills of Adwa, Menelik's forces emerged in perfect coordination, converging from multiple directions with a strength and unity Italy had not imagined. The Ethiopians outnumbered the Europeans, but it was their strategy that proved decisive. Using the mountains and valleys to divide and surround, Menelik ensured that Italian formations would be fragmented, their advantage of firearms diminished by terrain and coordination. The Italians, confident and dismissive, were thrown into disarray as the battle unfolded. Ethiopian troops advanced with courage and discipline, attacking in waves and exploiting every vulnerability. Menelik himself, though not on the front lines, commanded with precision, responding to developments as they arose, adjusting movements, reinforcing positions, and ensuring morale remained high. Soldiers from across the nation fought not as separate groups, but as a single, unified force, bound by the leadership of a king who had outthought and outplanned the European invaders. The fighting was fierce, and the stakes immense. Each hill taken, each flank defended, was a statement. Africa would not be subdued, and as the sun rose over the battlefield, the realization began to dawn on the Italian commanders. Their empire was not invincible, their tactics insufficient against a leader who understood both his land and his people. By the end of the day, the Italian army was decisively defeated, leaving Ethiopia triumphant and Europe stunned. News of the victory spread rapidly across the continent and beyond. For African nations and people under colonial rule, Menelik's triumph became a symbol of hope, courage, and possibility. It demonstrated that European powers could be resisted, that African intelligence, strategy, and unity were forces to be reckoned with. Diplomatic negotiations followed. Treaties were rewritten, and Italy, chastened, was forced to acknowledge Ethiopia's sovereignty. Menelik II's legacy is profound. He was not a king who sought glory merely on the battlefield. He was a statesman who understood that power lay in wisdom as much as in strength. His victory at Adwa did more than repel an invader. It challenged the global narrative that Africa was a passive land waiting for European conquest. The Battle of Adwa became a turning point in history, a story of strategy, foresight, and the courage to defend one's homeland against overwhelming odds. Even today, the battle resonates. It is remembered as a moment when Africa demonstrated its agency, intelligence, and resilience on the world stage. Menelik II's triumph reminds us that history is not always written by the victors of war, but also by those whose wisdom and courage reshaped the course of nations. Europe had underestimated Africa, and in that miscalculation, a king, a people, and a nation proved that sovereignty and strategy could triumph over arrogance and empire. The story of Menelik II and the Battle of Adwa is more than history. It is a lesson in leadership, foresight, and unity. It teaches that intelligence and preparation can defeat even the most confident adversary, that courage multiplied by strategy can change the world. As we reflect on that day, we see not just a battle won, but a narrative reclaimed, a story that Europe tried to obscure, a story of African strength, pride, and brilliance. And so, when we remember Menelik II, we remember the king who outsmarted Europe, the leader who turned ambition into victory, and the nation that refused to bow. His story is a reminder that the pages of history are filled with moments that defy expectation, that the margins often hold the most powerful tales, and that Africa's role in shaping the world is deeper, richer, and more profound than many realize. History often remembers empires as unstoppable forces. For centuries, the great powers of Europe marched across continents, raising their flags over distant lands and declaring their dominance over peoples they believed were weaker. To them, Africa was not a land of ancient kingdoms or proud civilizations. It was simply territory, a place to conquer, a place to control. But on the rugged mountains of northern Ethiopia, that belief meant something it had never truly faced before: resistance, unity, and leadership powerful enough to challenge the arrogance of empire. When the guns finally fell silent after the Battle of Adwa, the world realized something remarkable had happened. This was not just another battle in a distant land. This was a moment that would echo across continents. For the first time during the age of European colonial expansion, an African army had defeated a modern European invading force in open battle, and they had done it decisively. The shock that followed spread rapidly across Europe. Newspapers reported the disaster with disbelief. Military leaders tried to explain how such a defeat had been possible. Politicians in Italy faced outrage from citizens who had expected glory but received humiliation. The empire that had marched into Ethiopia expecting victory had instead met one of the greatest strategic defeats of the colonial era. But the meaning of Adwa went far beyond embarrassment of one European nation. Across Africa, news of the victory traveled like wildfire. For people living under colonial rule, the story carried a powerful message. European armies were not invincible. Colonial power was not absolute. Resistance was possible. Hope was possible. And for many Africans and people of African descent around the world, the victory of Ethiopia became a symbol of pride, a reminder that African leadership, intelligence, and courage could shape the course of history. At the center of that moment stood a man whose foresight had changed everything. Menelik II was not simply a warrior king. He was a strategist, a diplomat, a leader who understood that power came not only from strength, but from preparation, unity, and patience. Long before the first shots were fired, Menelik had already begun shaping the outcome of the war. He studied the ambitions of Europe. He strengthened alliances across Ethiopia. He modernized his army. And perhaps most importantly, he united a diverse nation under a shared purpose. Because Menelik understood something many rulers did not. A divided country cannot defend its freedom, but a united people can accomplish extraordinary things. Under his leadership, warriors from across Ethiopia came together. Different languages, different traditions, different regions. But on the battlefield of Adwa, they fought as one nation. That unity became the foundation of victory. and it ensured that Ethiopia would remain one of the few African nations to preserve its sovereignty during the height of colonial expansion. Yet Menelik's vision extended beyond the battlefield. After the war, he focused on strengthening Ethiopia as a modern state. Roads were built, trade expanded, diplomatic relations with other nations grew, and the capital city of Addis Ababa developed into a center of political and cultural life. Ethiopia was no longer just a kingdom that had resisted invasion. It had become a respected nation on the world stage. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Adwa was the inspiration it gave to others. In the decade that followed, anti-colonial movements across Africa and the Caribbean would look to Ethiopia as proof that resistance could succeed. Activists, scholars, and leaders spoke of Adwa as a turning point in global history. It showed that the narrative of European superiority was deeply flawed. It reminded the world that Africa was not merely a victim of history. It was a maker of history. Even today, more than a century later, the memory of Adwa continues to carry deep meaning. In Ethiopia, the battle is remembered not only as a military victory, but as a symbol of national pride and unity. Every generation is reminded of the courage and determination that defended their independence. And around the world, historians continue to study the battle as one of the most significant events of the colonial era, because Adwa did something rare in history. It challenged the assumptions of an entire age. It forced powerful nations to reconsider their beliefs, and it demonstrated that intelligence, leadership, and unity could overcome even the most confident empire. The mountains where the battle took place still stand today, silent witnesses to the moment when history shifted, when a nation refused to bow, when a king outsmarted an empire, and when Africa reminded the world of its strength. The story of Adwa is not simply about war. It is about dignity. It is about sovereignty. It is about the determination of a people to protect their homeland and to find their own future. And in that story, the legacy of Menelik II continues to live on. A king who understood his enemies, a leader who united his people, and a strategist whose victory changed how the world saw Africa. Because sometimes a single battle can rewrite history. And sometimes, the most powerful victories are the ones that remind humanity that freedom is never easily taken from those who are willing to defend it. The hills of Adwa still whisper that truth, and they always will.